Okay, welcome everyone. This is Fran Miller for WebYeshiva. We're talking tonight about Shulchan Orech. We're part of the Seder series, right? The Seder of the Seder, the order of the Seder, going through the different steps. And tonight we are up to this yummy matzo ball, looking matzo ball soup, the meal part of the Seder. Okay, so if we think about the steps of the Seder, I wrote them out for you, right? Kadesh Orchat, source number 1. Karpas Yachat Magid Rachza Motzi Matzah. Marur Korich Shulchan Orech Tzafum Barich Halel Nirtzah. So if you take a moment to think about which one is unlike the others, okay? And if you want to write in the chat, you can even answer which one's different. Or you could also unmute yourselves. So I'm sure you can come up with different reasons why different ones might be different, but something that's striking is Shulchan Orech stands out as opposed to all of these, that there's no text, right? If you look in all of the, in fact, this was actually a challenging shir for me to prepare, right? I love giving very textual based shirim, and if you look in all the, I have a shelf of Haggadahs probably behind me on the bookcase over there. Probably a lot of them are off the bookcase now because they're sitting here on my desk because I've been looking at them recently. But if I went through the Haggadahs on my shelf, and all the Haggadahs just have this little note of, okay, here we eat the Seder meal, and there's really no text here. And so the question is, right, there's no mefarshim here. So like, okay, what are we going to talk about over here? But don't worry, I have a share prepared. But it's something actually that's striking. If you think about all the rest of these, there's some amount of text or that we're going to say along with these different steps. And the Shulchan Orech is just, we're going to eat our meal. And the question I want to pose and try to explore a little bit tonight is, does the meal we eat at the Seder nevertheless have some spiritual meaning? It might seem to us that Magid is the spiritual part, right? We describe the fundamental belief that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. We retell our birth as a nation. We go through this whole story, how bad the slavery was, and now we're free and God's taking us out. And then, we can continue from there into the beginnings of, actually in the Magid section itself, right, we have the beginnings of Hallel, where we burst into this song and this praise of God. So that's certainly a spiritual experience to come to this realization and to tell this story. And we're learning, halachic text. We're learning text also. It's textual study. That's a spiritual experience. But what about Shulchan Orech? So it could be, right? So we did, these are like the spiritual parts. And in the middle, we stick in this more human, more material, more mundane thing, which is we also have to eat a meal. Like, we're going to be hungry, right? It's a long night. We have to get through it. We're going to eat our meal. Or there's the joke that emerged, I think it was like this: they tried to kill us, we won, now let's eat. That you can basically sum up a lot of the Jewish holidays this way. Right, so for Pesach, it's Paro tried to destroy us, we won, let's eat. For Chanukah, we have the Greeks tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And so is there anything more? Is it just, a joke about the Jewish holiday, that's how they work? Or is there something more here? And I want to argue that there is more halachic and spiritual significance to this meal. And there is an underlying reason why food is included as part of the celebration of Jewish holidays. And especially significant is the food on Seder night. It's not just this, extra thing we're doing because we're humans and we need to do it, but the Seder meal, there's something essential about this meal that's an essential part of our experience. And there's a reason beyond the practical need to eat that it made it in as one of the simanim of the Seder. Okay, so first I want to mention some minhagim, some traditions of the food from Seder night, of Shulchan Orech, and I think these shed light on historically what this meal was really like, which is going to help us frame what actually this meal is about. Okay. So we're going to go back and we're going to go to the times of the Beit HaMikdash. And in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, of course, there is an obligation to bring korbanot, to bring special offerings for Pesach. We have the Korban Pesach, right, which shares the same name. There was an obligation to bring the Korban Pesach the day before on Yud Daled. And there was also the Korban Chagiga, which are the other offerings of the holiday. And they would be brought on Yudala during the day, and they need to be eaten in Yerushalayim. They need to be eaten that night. So basically, what would happen is the Jews would journey on the 14th to Yerushalayim. Each family or group, right? They had to be grouped around, as in a group of how many people would eat the particular animal. Each family or group would sacrifice their offering, and that night on Leil HaSeder, so if they brought on the 14th, that night would now be the 15th, would be Seder night. And that night they would eat the meat of these korbanot as part of their Seder in Yerushalayim. We have an ancient tradition, the story of Magid, the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the story of recounting the exodus from Egypt, is meant to be told over the special meal that they're eating, and that's the Pesach matzah and maror. And we have this, it comes out in a few different places. I brought you the part from the Haggadah because that's the most familiar. If you look in source number 2 says, Yachol me Rosh Chodesh. I might have thought that we should start discussing Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, already from Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right? From this Thursday, we need to start discussing it, is what we might have thought, but this is a initial thought that's going to be rejected. Talmud Lomar B'yomahu, but the pasuk says on that day, which means specifically on the 15th. B'yom hahu, well, it means specifically the day with the Korban Pesach. It might be the 14th. I would think already on that day, meaning the afternoon of the 14th, while I'm bringing the Korban Pesach. Talmud Lomar ba'avur zeh. But the pasuk says when you eat the Korban Pesach, you should tell your son, why am I doing this? I'm doing this ba'avur zeh. Ba'avur zeh means because of this. What's because of this? So often in Midrashim, zeh is going to be, Rashi and the Torah points this out in a bunch of different places. I don't know if you're familiar. You could be on the lookout for it now. A lot of times zeh is going to mean something physical, something tangible you can point to with your finger. And so as you say over here, ba'avur zeh, what is because of this means? It means because this, something I'm pointing to in front of me. It says ba'avur zeh lo amarti ela b'sha'ah sheyesh matzah u'maror munachim lefanecha. We say because of this, at a time where you have the matzah and the maror resting in front of you. Okay, basically from the pasuk, we learn that we need to do Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. We have to tell the story of the exodus from Egypt with the matzah and with the maror in front of you. Also the Pesach. Okay, we don't have a Pesach today, but there's an idea of the story being told with these special foods that are going to help us tell the story. Okay, and in the words of the Gemara, the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, of telling the story, is specifically at a time where the matzah and the maror is in front of you. And these elements are so important. Rabban Gamliel says they're actually the essence of the Seder, right? Rabban Gamliel in the Haggadah says, Rabban Gamliel haya omer, kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim ha'elu b'Pesach lo yatsa yedei chovato. Anyone who didn't say these three things on Pesach didn't fulfill his obligation. The Eluhim, Pesach, Matzah, Maror, and these are the three things: the Pesach, which is the Pesach offering, the Matzah, and the Maror. And it seems like these aren't just sort of magic words that we need to say, but rather, right, this paragraph of Rabban Gamliel goes on to explain why we're eating these things. And also, we know today we don't do this with the Korban Pesach because we don't have it, but we're indicating the matzah we lift when we read the matzah paragraph, the maror we lift when we read the maror paragraph. Right? These are like visual aids. These are experiential elements that are going to help us tell the story. So he goes on to say, Pesach, you have to explain. Pesach shayu avotenu ochlim bizman beit hamikdash shebeit hamikdash haya kayam al shuma. The Pesach, which by the way we don't eat today, but they were eating in the times of when the Beit Hamikdash was standing. Why do we eat it? Al shum shepasach hakadosh baruch hu al batei avotenu mitzrayim, because God skipped over, and the language of Pesach means to pass over, right? Passover. God skipped over the houses of our forefathers in Mitzrayim. And he proves this from the pasuk that this is what we're supposed to explain. Shenamar v'amartem zevach Pesach hu l'Hashem asher pasach al batei b'nei b'nei Yisrael mitzrayim b'nakfot mitzrayim batenu hitzil v'kol ha'am yishtachavu. And you'll say to your children when you bring the Korban Pesach, this sacrifice is for Hashem, because he passed over the houses of our ancestors in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, and he saved us, and the people agree with this and bow down. Okay, matzah, so if you look, actually in the Hebrew, there's a little note here where he actually holds the matzah in his hand, and he shows it to the people who are present at the table. Matzah zu shanu ochlim al shumah. This matzah that's in front of us right now that we would eat, why do we eat it? We eat it because Shelo Haspeak B'tzekam Mishal Avotinu Lachmitz Ad Shenigla Le'am Melech Malchei Malchim HaKadosh Baruch Hu V'Ga'alam. The dough of our ancestors didn't have time to rise until God came, the King of Kings came and revealed himself and redeemed them. Shene'amar B'yafu et habatek asher hotziu mitzrayim ugot matzot kilo chametz. It tells us a little bit later on, once they go out of Mitzrayim, when they get to Sukkot, then they bake the dough that they've taken out of Mitzrayim into matzot. And the pasuk tells us, why do they bake into matzot? Because it had not had a chance to rise, because they were expelled from Egypt. They were sent out very quickly. They couldn't tarry. They couldn't prepare for themselves food. And the maror, ochez maror biyado umar el tolam esubin, right? We have this note again that he picks up the maror and he holds it. Maror zu shanu ochlim al shumah. Why do we eat this maror? Al shum shemaru mitzrayim et chayim utinu b'mitzrayim shene'amar b'mur et chayim b'avodah kasha b'chomer ulevanim b'chol avodah b'sadeh et kol avotam asher avdu b'hem b'farach. This maror, why do we eat it? We eat it to recollect that the Mitzrayim, that the Egyptians embittered the lives of our forefathers, of our ancestors in Mitzrayim, and bring a pasuk to prove this, where it says that they made their lives bitter with hard work, with bricks and mortar, with all the difficult work in the field, and they worked them avodat parach. Avodat parach is back-breaking labor. And so what comes out from this piece, especially in Rabbi Gamliel, is the idea of the food is actually an essential part of these, at least these particular symbolic foods, are an essential part of telling over the story. And this was the food, actually, in the time of Beit HaMikdash that they were eating. They weren't having another meal after this. They were eating the korbanot. Today we don't have the Korban Pesach, so then we go on and make other foods for the meal, right? But they're essentially, in the time of Beit HaMikdash, they were eating the korban and the different things that accompany it, the maror and the matzah, right, alongside with it. And so these are being used as visual aids in order to tell the story, in order to make the story come alive and make it something more tangible. And in fact, another sort of approach, beyond just being a visual aid that kind of shows us what happens, is that these elements are actually helping us experience a taste of what it actually was, what the story actually was, what was actually happening in Mitzrayim. If you look at, where is it? Here, source 5, skip source 4, we'll go back to it in a minute. If you look at source 5, where's the line I want? Here, look after the 3 dots. Bechol, let me put the arrow, 1 second. Here, I'm putting it here, but then I'm going to move it so you can see the text. Bechol dor vador chayav adam leharot et atzmo kilu hu b'atzmo yatsa. Actually, let's go back for a minute. If you look in after Rabbi Gamliel, after he says these 3 things, hold on, I went back too far, I think. After he says these 3 things, he says, in every generation, a person should see themselves. Bechol dor vador chayav adam leharot et atzmo kilu yatsa mitzrayim. In every generation, a person should see himself as if he went out of Mitzrayim. So that's how we're meant to view ourselves, and perhaps, these elements are helping us tell the story as visual aids. But if you look in Rambam, so notice that word lirot. If you look in Rambam has something very similar, but actually changes 1 word. Instead of saying lirot, he says leharot. Leharot means to show, not to view oneself, to show. A person needs to show themselves. What does that mean? A person needs to act it out. What does it mean to be, right? What does it mean to be slaves? Their lives are really bitter. And how am I going to experience that? I'm going to eat something bitter, and that's going to help me act it out. I'm going to put myself in their shoes, right? I'm going to eat this matzah, which is either the bread of slavery or bread that reminds us the haste of the gula. That was my other share, right? You could go back and listen if you weren't there. I'm going to use these. I'm going to do certain acts. I can't really feel as much as the slaves in Mitzrayim actually felt, but I'm going to do different things to show myself, to present myself as if I was in that situation. And that's going to include these experiential elements, right? So these foods, they're not just random foods. They actually become essential elements that are going to help us tell the story. Okay. And besides for the matzah and the maror, right, just to sort of reiterate, so we have this really, I have to say, we have this very, very sweet children's book. It's called Pesach Bamikdash. It's about a little boy named Yonatan. It really tells the story of how I just can't teach this year without thinking of this book, because it explains it so well. That it really tells the story of how the Jews in the time of Beit HaMikdash were celebrating Pesach. And so they were going up to Yerushalayim, as I said, and they would look for a place to stay, and they would bring their korban. And in this book, so basically the big brother is roasting the Pesach. We know the Pesach has to be tzli'eh, so he's essentially barbecuing the Pesach. And during that time, they start telling the story of Pesach, and this is a sort of a big family meal over the eating of the Korban Pesach is where we're doing this magid of telling the story. And in fact, right, so you can see this, if you look in the Mishnah in the 10th parak of Pesachim, a lot of the Mishnayot and then the Gemaras there relate to what actually goes on Leil Seder. On Seder night, there's a lot of other things that come up in Pesachim in general about chametz and matzah and about bedika chametz and biur chametz and all sorts of other things. But if you want to look for the chapter that deals the most with, obviously there's things here and there because the Gemara is not exactly organized like this, but if you want to look for the chapter that deals the most with Leil Seder, what we're doing on Seder night, it's going to be in the 10th chapter. And if you go through the Mishnah, you'll see I brought quite a few Mishnah from there. You go through the Mishnah there, they kind of walk you through. This is how the Seder goes, right? And it's all structured around the Arba Kos. So they pour the first cup, and then this, and he says Kiddush. Okay, and look at this one. They pour the second cup. Mazgulo Kos Sheni. They pour the second cup, and what happens? What's over the second cup? Essentially, we say Magid over the second cup, right? We're going to do the section of Magid of telling the story. And how does Magid start? So basically, the opening of Magid, and we have Halach Manya, which is the later edition. Basically, the opening of Magid is the Manishtana. And look at the Mishnah. They pour in the second cup. V'kan haben shoel et aviv, and this is where, right, it's scripted. This is where the son asked his father the questions. And by the way, the Mishnah says, Im ein dat beven aviv melamdo, if the son doesn't have either he's little or just intelligence-wise, he doesn't have the ability that he's going to generate these questions on his own. The father needs to teach him, needs to open him up. And he asks the questions. And let's look at the questions. We're going to notice a striking difference from how we're used to hearing the questions. Let's see the question. How different is this night from all the other nights? All other nights we eat chametz and matzah. This night we only eat matzah. So far the same, right? I know different minhagim have maybe a different order of the questions, but so far the questions are all the same. On all other nights we eat all sorts of vegetables, other vegetables. Tonight we only eat maror. Okay, now we're up to the bolded part. And this is different. On all other nights, we eat meat prepared in all sorts of ways, roasted and boiled and cooked. But tonight, we only eat roasted meat. Now, this is a question. We don't have this question. This is a question from the time of the Beit HaMikdash when what they were eating was the Korban Pesach, which we know is roasted. And they're only eating that roasted meat that night. It can't be boiled. It can't be cooked in water or anything like that. Cooked in any liquid. It's roasted. It's basically barbecued, right? Dry roasted. So in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, because they're eating the Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach is a central element of what's going on there, an essential part over what they're telling the story with, they have this extra question about the Korban Pesach. I'll just go on so that you can see which question they don't have here that we have. But the fourth question, so the Mishnah has 4 questions, right? We have a lot of themes of 4 on this night. The fourth question here in the Mishnah is there's also different versions of the text here. If it's we only dip once or we don't even dip once, okay, that's to do with also culturally what was done in different places. But let's read the text that we have in front of us. Other nights we dip once. Tonight we dip twice because we have the maror and the karpas. V'lefi dato ben aviv milamdo, and according to the intelligence or the ability of the son and his father to teach him. And how does he teach him? Matchil b'gnut u'mesayim b'shevach. He starts with the bad things and goes on to the praise. And vidorish me'arami oved avi achigmar kol parsha kula. He starts from arami oved avi, which is essentially mikra bikurim, the pasukim from the Torah, until he finishes reading that whole parsha. Anyway, so the question that we don't have this middle question, but we do have 4 questions. This third question we don't have. So we've replaced that with a question about reclining, right? And all other nights we recline. But in the times of Beit HaMikdash, right, because of the centrality of the Korban Pesach, it actually made it into the questions, and the fact that it's being prepared in a very specific way, and there's no other meat being eaten in different ways, was something that is supposed to raise, right, the light bulb goes on for the kid, raise question marks for the kid, and one thing the kid is going to ask about. Okay, and this is what they're eating. This is their Yom Tov meal, the korbanot. Now, first, what they would eat, I mentioned there's the korban chagiga and the korban pesach. What they would eat first is the korban chagiga, and then they would eat the korban pesach. There's an idea of what's called eating al hasova. It says eating the korban pesach once you're already most of the way full, or either you're eating korban pesach because that's when you're going to get full. Okay, that's what's going to fill you up, or you're eating it once you're almost all the way full, and that's the last thing that you're eating. So what that means is, because of this idea of eating it like that, what's called al hasova, okay, when you're full, or to be the thing that fills you up, there's different readings of it. Because of that, first they would eat their korban chagiga, which are the other korbanot that they're bringing for Pesach. And once they would basically save enough room that the Pesach, that is going to be what fills them up the rest of the way, then they would eat the korban pesach. So the korban pesach is either like the main or course or the dessert, something like that. That's their meal. That's their Yom Tov meal. Now, in terms of halacha for today, the korban pesach was roasted meat. After the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, it seems that there were places where the tradition developed not to eat roasted meat on the Seder, on Seder night, for fear that it would look like they brought the korban pesach in the absence of the Beit HaMikdash, which is really bad, right? Bringing a korban outside of the Beit HaMikdash is problematic. So we don't want to make it look like we did that. And so if you look in the Mishnah, where is this? Okay, this Tosefta that I skipped was that point about al hasova, that you bring the chagiga so that it's eaten first, so that the Pesach is eaten al hasova. Sverga translates that as eaten upon being satiated. But if we go on to the Mishnah in Pesachim, it says, Makom shenagu lachotz li b'leilei Pesachim ochlim, makom shenagu shelo lachol ein ochlim. In a place where people were accustomed to eat roasted meat on the nights of Pesach, obviously outside of Yerushalayim, after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, or after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, you can. In a place where people were accustomed not to, you shouldn't. And Rashi says, "Shelo lachol demechzi ka'ochel Pesach b'chutz." Right? What's the problem? Why did in some place this tradition develop not to eat roasted meat? Because it looks like I brought the korban Pesach without a Beit HaMikdash, or outside of the Beit HaMikdash, right? Not in Yerushalayim, and that would be problematic. That's a very big prohibition. Okay, so some places were concerned about this. Some places weren't. Chachamim said what's called minhag hamakom. We go by the practice of that place. In a place where the tradition is not to eat, so don't eat it. But if it's a place where they include roasted meat at the Seder, it's not a problem. And just in terms of how far this minhag extended, I brought you the Shulchan Orech and the Mishnah Berurah. But it seems that it wasn't just, right, what was the Korban Pesach brought from? The Korban Pesach was brought from lamb or sheep. But it seems that the minhag, the places that did have this minhag not to eat roasted meat, it wasn't just lamb and sheep. It was extended to other types of meat and also even chicken. Let's just read the Shulchan Orech for a minute in source 9. He says, Makom shenagu lachotz li b'leilei Pesachim ochlim, makom shenagu shelo lachol ein ochlim. Okay, so far it's just the Mishnah. In a place where they have this tradition to eat it, they can eat it. In a place where they have tradition not to, don't eat it. Why? Gizir Hashem yubru Pesachu. Maybe they'll think it's a Pesach. Now it says, B'chol makom asur lachol setzli. kulo kechad b'layla zeh. Everyone agrees in every single place you can't take a whole roasted lamb because that really looks like korban pesach. So the question is also, and it becomes just a different part of it, or other types of meat. If you look in Bet, right, he goes on to say, afilu basar egel ve'of kol davar sheta'un shchita asur la'achotz li v'makom shenagu shla'achotz li. If you're in a place where the practice that developed is not to eat roasted meat, so that extends to anything that requires shchita, anything that requires ritual slaughtering. So that would include cow, chicken, right? Even things that would certainly not be brought for the Korban Pesach. It's extended to that. And we're going to come back to this Ramah in a minute, but the Mishnah Berurah points out, right, what is the okay, anything that requires ritual sacrifice, but what ritual slaughter, what did that exclude? He says, one second, the next one. Shetaun shchita, lafuke dagimu beitzim, mutar lachlam tzluim. Okay, we have other animal product, we could say, or animals themselves, which are fish or eggs, both don't need shchita, right? Don't need ritual slaughter. Those things, it's okay to eat roasted. On the Seder, it doesn't look anything like meat. Nobody's going to think that this is a Korban Pesach that you brought out of, right? That's already too far removed. That you brought outside of the Beit HaMikdash. No one's concerned about that. And you could do that. And you could have roasted eggs or roasted fish. Okay, it's only meat or poultry. Okay. And I brought the other Mishnah Berurah. Okay, so it seems to be in a lot of places today, right? The practice is not to eat roasted meat, although not everywhere. But I read the other Mishnah Berurah that explains to us, I think it's in this Mishnah Berurah, that explains to us how you may prepare it, right? So he says, okay, first of all, he talks about, right, people keep Yom Tov Sheni. They don't do this. They don't have roasted meat for both nights. He says, afilu tzli kedar pirshin nitzle b'kdira below mayim b'shu mashka al mitbashel b'mahul hayotze mimenu af al pi sheino dome letzle hapesach shepesach nitzle b'kdira pasul afilu hachoy yesh la'osra. So he says even like the Pesach was really dry roasted. It wasn't in any sort of dish that was collected. It's liquid. This is like I'm blanking on the cooking terms here. Maybe someone else could chime in, right? But the Pesach is really like barbecued, right? It wasn't in any sort of dish. It was really dry roasted. It wasn't even sitting in its own juices. Now, what if I take a meat, or I take a piece of, I don't know, brisket, and I put it in a pan, and I just put a spice rub on it, but I cover that pan, and I put it in the oven. So essentially, the way that brisket's going to cook, it's not really dry roasted, because as it's cooking, the juice is going to come out of it, and it's going to be roasting in its own meat. And had I done that for the Korban Pesach, by the way, that would not be considered Slei Eish. That wouldn't count for my Korban Pesach. But the Mishnah Berurah says we're careful not even to do that. Not even to put something, I don't know what to call it. It's like baking it, and we're in it when it's in a dish where it's collecting its own juices, right? We don't even roast it in its own juices. That's also problematic. So how should you cook on Seder night? If you're going to cook it, you're going to add liquid, right? Either water or something else. Make sure to add enough water to, or other liquid, to your food that you're cooking on Seder night so that it's not in any way considered roasted. Okay, so of course, today, we don't have the Korban Pesach. We do have the Korech sandwich, right, which without the meat, where we put the matzah and mar together, where we kind of remember the special meal of the Korban Pesach, right? Zecher v'tashke Hillel. This is to remember Hillel, that Hillel would put these things together, because that's how he felt the Korban Pesach had to be eaten all put together in order to remember the time of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so that's the tradition with regard to meat. So we saw sort of the centrality of meat in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, and today the avoidance of having roasted meat in order to be careful not to mislead people to think that we have a Korban Pesach here. Let's go back to the Ramah that we skipped in source 9. The Ramah brings another tradition of Seder night. And the Ramah says like this: Noagim, starts the line before. Noagim, the Hey Gimel Hey is just telling us it's the Ramah. Comment, Noagim Beksat Mekomo Lechol Besuda Beitzim Zecher Le'avelut. In some places, the tradition is to eat eggs. And the Ramah says the reason they would eat eggs is it's a sign of mourning. Why are we mourning? Near Eli Shatam Mishum Shelil Tisha B'Av Nikva B'Leil Seder, because the night of Tisha B'Av, the timing of when it's going to come out, is basically going to be correlated to when Pesach came out. So when we're celebrating Pesach, we already know, looking ahead in the calendar, what day of the week Tisha B'Av is going to come out. So that's one reason we're mourning, because of Tisha B'Av is in our mind. The Od Zecher LeChorban Sheim Makrivim Korban Pesach. And also, we remember the destruction of the temple because they used to bring the Korban Pesach, and now we don't have it, so we're mourning. So that's how he explains it. That eggs are a sign of Aveda. Eggs are a sign of mourning. Why? Because traditionally in Jewish thought, round foods kind of represent the circle of life. Round foods are a sign of mourning, right? So the other common one people talk about is lentils, which Ashkenazim aren't eating on Pesach. But the egg, right, is a sign of mourning according to the Rambam that we eat on Seder night. We're mourning, first of all, because Tisha B'Av, we know when Tisha B'Av is going to fall out now. We're mourning about Tisha B'Av, and we're also mourning the destruction of the Mikdash, that we no longer have this Korban Pesach. And we're sad because we can't bring it. And so as a way of remembering this, right, we're going to eat the eggs. Now, the Gra rejects this. He says, what do you mean we're mourning on Seder night, right? Chas v'shalom, we're mourning on Seder night, right? We're not mourning. This is a day of celebrating that we're B'nai Chorin, that we're free people. We're not going to mourn Tisha B'Av on Seder night. And he gives a different reason for the egg. I think this is the commonly known one. This is definitely what I knew before I saw this from So why do we have the egg? He says, V'linirah, source 12, V'linirah tam mipnei she'osinoto zecher l'chagiga, v'tzarich le'echol. He says, we're doing it to recall, not because it's a sign of mourning, but to recall the chagiga. It reminds us of the Korban Chagiga. I don't know why specifically an egg reminds us of the Chagiga. I think I did know at some point, but I forget. If anyone knows, feel free to put in the chat. But the egg is supposed to represent the Korban Chagiga, and he said, Dafka, we should eat it, right? We don't eat the zroa on the Seder plate because it's roasted, and we just said we don't eat roast meat because we don't want to try to show that we have the Korban Pesach. And the afikoman, he says, is the thing that does recount the Korban Pesach for us, that we do eat, but we're not going to eat the zroa, that's the roasted meat on the Seder plate, but we do eat egg to represent the Korban Chagiga. So that's our nod to this, the fact that in Beit HaMikdash, what they would be eating is the Korban Chagiga and the Korban Pesach. Okay, and one more point while we're talking about traditions of eating on Seder night, and then we'll try to put some meaning into our Shulchan Orech, which we're already starting to see that it was the food that they're eating that night was an essential part of the story. One more point about the eating, and this is just a practical point. The Ramah also points out, I forget if I brought it here, let's see. Yeah. Look at this first, we read the second Ramah here in Bet, but let's look at the first one. This is just a practical point. It doesn't really have to do with what I'm working towards, but once we're talking about the eating, it is an important point. Lo yochal v'lo yishteh harbe yoter midai, shelo yochal afikoman al achila gasa o yishtaker v'sham biyad. Okay, so he says don't, so, by the way, I said korech is a way of remembering the Korban Pesach, because that's how Hillel thought it had to be eaten, but also the Gra we just saw, right, points out that afikoman is to remember the Korban Pesach. And why is that? This is a different share. I think I taught this maybe for WebYeshiva last year. You could also look for it in the archives if you want. But the afikoman is like our dessert, right? Because that's how the Korban Pesach was eaten. Remember, I said it was eaten al hasova. So you have our main meal, which was the chagiga in the time of Beit HaMikdash. Today, it's whatever we're eating at our Seder, right? Those yummy matzahs from the beginning, from the opening slide, something like that. We're eating our main meal. And then we're going on to eat what represents the Korban Pesach, which is the afikoman. And so he says, right, remember that when you're eating this meal, right, a wise person is thinking ahead. When you're eating your meal, remember that you're going to have to eat the afikoman. You're going to eat a measure of the afikoman. And we don't want you to be like stuffing we want you to be satisfied when you eat the afikoman, but we don't want you to be like stuffing yourself. It's called like chila gasa, right? When you're eating, when you're already full, it's just like, I don't know, gross, right? So we don't want to be too overly stuffing ourselves. We want to keep in mind as you're eating the Seder meal, and it's hard because you're hungry because you've been waiting all of the Seder, and there's yummy food because everyone went all out and made yummy food, and we're going to see that I think there's a halachic element to going all out and making yummy food, right? It's hard to do this, but this Ramah is saying, right, be careful not to eat too much, because we want you to save room for that afikoman. And he also says, be careful not to drink too much. There's an idea, by the way, I don't know if people do this because 4 cups of wine for most people is enough. But you can add more wine to, this is a festive Yom Tov meal, right? You could have more wine during the meal. But he says, be careful not to drink too much because then you're going to fall asleep and you're not going to finish your Seder, right? Relatable, kind of. People probably don't want to drink too much at that point because it's already late, and if they're drinking, they're gonna fall asleep. They're gonna miss the rest of the Seder, and that's no good. So just a practical point to have in mind in terms of eating is that you're gonna have to finish your Seder afterwards, and you're gonna have to eat the afikoman. So make sure to save room for that. Okay. So while we're going through how the Shulchan Orech talks about eating on Seder night, good thing to point out. Let's go back to. Let's see what we can say about the spiritual significance of Shulchan Orech. So first, I wanted to start with that historical background because I think it's important in terms of our understanding, right? In the times of the Beit HaMikdash, clearly, the food wasn't a side point, right? The story is specifically being told over these symbolic foods. It's meant to be told over these foods, right? The korban, when you have the korban Pesach in front of you, but when you bring the korban Pesach, you tell your kids, and this is why we did it, and this is the story because Hashem took it out of Mitzrayim. But avur zeh, because of the bitterness of slavery and the matzah, which is the haste of the geula, and the nace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu skipping over our houses and saving us, that's why we do it. And in the times of, right, today people get really into the Seder menu, right? In the times of the Beit HaMikdash, we had in the Torah, right, we had a special Seder menu. The menu, not every, right, person had to think by themselves, what's going to be my menu this year? But we had a menu dictated by the Torah, Pesach Matzah Maror, but the food was this main part of the experience, and the story was meant to be told over the food. And today, without these foods, maybe we can make them, without the Korban Pesach, we have the matzah and the maror. Without the Korban Pesach, maybe we can make the mistake of feeling that the meal's sort of a side point, right in the middle of the spiritual experience of Magid, of Hallel. We're going to stop and take a break and, a nod to our humanness and enjoy some food. But I don't think that's true. We have a unique law, a unique halacha of Korban Pesach, and it's essentially, is another Mishnah Pesachim. Essentially, the halacha of Pesach is that the halachot of Pesach are different because the goal of the Pesach is that it's meant to be eaten, right? It says the Pesach is brought even in a state of ritual impurity. It has to be when the majority of the nation is in a state of ritual impurity. Because the whole intention of the Korban Pesach is for it to be eaten. Now, that's unlike other korbanot, where the rule is, first of all, they're not brought in a state of ritual impurity, but also, or if they're brought in a state of ritual impurity, they're not allowed to be eaten. But the Korban Pesach is different, right? It's not something that's meant to be burnt. It's not something that's meant to be consumed by the Kohanim. This is something that people are bringing and they're meant to eat. And this is a unique thing about the Korban Pesach, and as we saw, it influences the laws with, for example, with regard to if people are impure, also with regard to if the parts of the korban that aren't eaten, the chilev, the fats that aren't eaten, become impure, you can still sprinkle the blood of the Korban Pesach, even though for most korbanot you wouldn't do that, because the primary intention of the Korban Pesach is for people to eat it. And I think what this is getting to is that on Seder night, we're all meant to eat from the sacrifice. And what's eating from the sacrifice? Eating from the sacrifice is essentially eating from God's table, right? Or what's in halachic terminology called Shulchan Gavoa. On this night of Pesach, God invites us to eat from his table, we're invited to this king's feast, we're guests of God. And he says, bring the Korban Pesach in my Beit HaMikdash, right? This is Kachim, something that's being brought in the Beit HaMikdash. It has very specific laws of how to bring it and how we have to treat it and how we have to use it up by a certain time and things like that. It's something that's kadosh, right? It has the sanctity of the Beit HaMikdash, but we're being invited in to eat it. And this is the idea of the meal on Seder night, that we're all kings, we're all free people, and we are being invited to eat from God's table. Now, to make ourselves feel a little bit better, so we understood that the Korban Pesach is that, make ourselves feel a little bit better about missing the Korban Pesach, I wanted to point out that the matzah itself is very symbolic of eating from korbanot to God, right? Of eating from God's spiritual food, right? From his king's feast, from what's called Shulchan Gavoa, the table of the highest table, right? The Beit HaMikdash table. matzah, right, in the Beit HaMikdash, we mostly don't bring any chametz except for the shtei lechem of Shavuot. But normally, right, the menachot, the flour offerings that we bring, are not chametz, right? They're matzah. So matzah itself, right, obviously the matzah we're eating today wasn't actually sanctified for Beit HaMikdash because we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, but the matzah itself is very reminiscent of the offerings that we brought to God in the Beit HaMikdash, of these mincha offerings. So we don't have the Pesach anymore, but today we do have the things that we're eating along with it. We have the matzah and we have the maror, and we're still partaking in this royal feast. And also to show that it's a royal feast, we have other halachot of Seder night. We're drinking our 4 cups of wine. We're reclining like kings. Right? We're reclining the wrong way. It should be left, right? I guess it's opposite on your screen anyway. We're reclining to the left. We're at a royal Suda. We're at a royal meal. And so the Shulchan Orech course of the meal, it's a big feast, and not just because we are people and enjoy food and want to go all out, right? When our Bubbies want to go all out with their special family recipes. It's because it's a banquet of kings, right? On this night, we're guests of God, and that's essential to the message of the night, right? We're celebrating tonight that we're free people, that we're all kings. And actually, something that I think really emphasizes this point is going back and looking. Let's look at for a second at the structure of the Seder. Let's go back to the first source. You can kind of see this. So interestingly, we have kind of, I guess it could be like a chiastic structure. We have this structure where Shulchan Orech is actually the center of the Seder. Why? Let's think about the Arba Kosot. We have 4 cups, right? We have 2 before, and we have 2 after. Okay? And what else? We have matzah before, right over here is matzah. And then we have, what do we have after Shulchan Orech? Tzafun, which is afikomen. We have matzah before, matzah after. We have Hallel. I mentioned at the start, the beginning of Hallel, we said the end of Magid. It's not called the Hallel step yet, but it's part of Magid, but it is Hallel. And then we have after Hallel, right? So we have all these things that are sort of surrounding this important, usually when we have this type of structure where we have something before and something after, something before, something after, something being bookended like this, it's to sort of highlight actually what's in the middle. And so if you look at this structure where we have 2 cups before, 2 cups after, matzah before, matzah after, Hallel before and Hallel after, what do we have in the middle? Shulchan Orech. Shulchan Orech is the star. It's not a side point. It's not an afterthought. It's actually the star of the night, because this is where we're going to feel like kings. We're going to feel what we're essentially meant to experience on this night. And it's not a break from the Seder at all in order to sort of feed ourselves, but it's actually part of the experience we're supposed to have, maybe the most experiential element, right? There's no text, there's no talking, but it's part of giving us that feeling of being free, of being kings on Seder night. And it's not just a regular meal. It's not even a regular Shabbat or Yom Tov meal, but it's a way of us feeling B'nai Chorin, feeling B'nai Melachim. And when you think of it that way, as the Seder of the Shulchan Orech being sort of the center, right, with all these other things framing it. So then Magid, it wasn't that Magid was the main thing and then Shulchan Orech was this afterthought because we're hungry, right? Actually, Magid is preparation for the Suda. Once we've gone through the experience of Magid, we've told the whole story, this frames to us, right, what our experience of Shulchan Orech is supposed to be. It frames to us how special tonight is, that we're B'nai Chorin, how special this Suda is. And then we're going to really be able to experience our freedom now that we've told the whole story and we understand where we are. We're going to really enjoy our meal. And we're going to do what we do in a normal meal, right? We're going to proceed with Kiddush and with Dayim. And then before going straight into the meal, like a regular Shabbos, we're going to stop, we're going to pause and explain what we're doing here, right? We're going to tell the story in order to understand what we're doing. And that was exactly what was happening with the Korban Pesach, right? When you bring the Korban Pesach, you should explain to your kids that this is why we're doing it. We're going to pause, we're going to tell Magid, and then we're going to eat the main star of the night, which is the meal that expresses our feelings of being B'nai Chorin. And this approach is really highlighted, I think, by the Rambam. I went back, so let's get back to it. You see a halacha in the Rambam that really reflects this is over here in source 14. In 14, Rambam talks about when you should recline. And we know that you're supposed to recline for the matzah, you're supposed to recline for the Arba Kosot, right? And reclining is a sign of being free people. And he says, if you can recline while eating and drinking the rest of the time, right, during your meal, then it's praiseworthy. Okay, and if you can't, because I guess it's a lot of reclining, it's not required, right? But why would we want you to recline during the meal? Because the meal, right, every time we recline is because we're showing we're free people. And the meal is actually part of experiencing that freedom of the night. So I think that's the point of Shulchan Orech. And I want to end off with a few other ideas of how we can further elevate our meal. One thing is, so if you look in the Tashbetz in Masechet Avot, he says that when you have three people eat together and they say Divrei Torah, they share words of Torah, then it's like they're eating Mishulchano Shel Makom Baruch Hu, right? It's like they're eating from the table of God. And that seems to be the goal, right? That's what I said. The reason the Korban Pesach, the whole point is to be eating from God's sacrifices. Okay, so in general, a rule is that we see in the Tashbetz, a way to elevate a meal is to share Divrei Torah. And so to remember that Divrei Torah, it depends if you share them all in Magid already, right? But I actually think good advice is not to share everything in Magid because it gets a little bit long, especially if there's, younger people in the Seder or older people, whoever it is, people that it's hard to sit through. To save some of the Divrei Torah, do Magid, and share some of those Divrei Torah once people are a little bit more calm because they have their food. But also, right, it's actually a way of elevating the food, making sure that this is a spiritual meal, making sure that it's a meal where we remember that we're eating from God's table. And another approach to think about the Shulchan Orech is that it's a Sudat Hodaya. Okay, and there's this idea of, about the Pasuk, the first time we see someone making a Sudat Hodaya, feast to say thank you for something, is Avraham, back in Bereshit, right? When Yitzchak, he has after many years of being childless, right? They have Yitzchak, and Yitzchak grows up and he's weaned, and Avraham makes for him a big party. And this is the original source of the Sudat Hodaya. He wanted to say thank you to God for this child, and he made a big feast. And that's a concept we have in general, right? If someone has something that happens to them that they feel is worth saying thank you, so they'll make a meal. And the meal of Shulchan Orech is like a Sudat Hodaya. Now that we've told the whole story in Magid, and we even start saying Hallel, right? So we're framing our Shulchan Orech with Hallel, right? We told the whole story of God saving us. We're so thankful to Hashem for taking us out. And so we're going to have this lavish Sudat Hodaya to say thank you to him, and we're going to frame it with Hallel to show that it's all part of the same thing of thanking God. So we're going to go from saying Hallel to eating as a Sudat Hodaya to continue saying Hallel, right? It's all part of praising God. And so that's also another framing of it. So we saw, I would say, two ideas of Shulchan Orech. One, that the idea, it's the experiential elements of the Seder where we really, after framing it by telling the story, we can really experience what it means to be free people on this night, right? And people who go all out and make fancy feasts, it's not just because they like to cook or because they're seva, they're actually doing it right. They're showing they're free people, and this is a fancy feast. And so one thing is for remembering that we are all free people. We're eating from God's table. He redeemed us to be free people. And another thing is we can think about it as a Sudat Hodaya. Now that we told the whole story and we're filled with thanks to God for saving us, so we're going to have this meal in order to say thank you to him, and we're going to frame it with Divrei Torah and with Hallel, with praise, in order to bring Kiddusha into our meal. And I'll end off with the Orchot Chaim says that the meal should be eaten bisimcha, right? Achar ochel sudato bisimcha. Okay, so we don't have, again, I said we don't have much text with regard to what's going on to the meal, but he said the meal has to be eaten with happiness. And this is a meal where we're rejoicing for the salvation God has given us. So I hope that gives some insight into the Seder meal, and wishing everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.